Excuse me. Thank you, Dalida. And I also want to thank Pedro Pablo for hosting us here and for the vision of both of you for Migratory Times. It is really an honor to be part of this project and have this opportunity to speak on this really distinguished panel. I also want to thank ASAB, the institution. I want to thank the faculty and students for their support for this project. It's an incredible school, and as we were saying yesterday, art schools are very, very difficult to maintain, but so important, particularly now in a world that is so riven by conflict and violence. So, in any case, thank you again for the invitation. I'm going to talk about three works, one of which will be shown here. I'm going to conclude with the piece that, in fact, Dalida and I collaborated on for this exhibition, and we're going to show you a piece of that piece and try to describe it to you. But I'm also going to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about two very disparate works and two bodies of work that began for me in the 1980s and extended through the 1990s and into the 2000s. I should say about myself that my work is largely media-based and has been media-based for a very, very long time. I went to school in the 1980s, and it was a time of great kind of upheaval, much as this time. It was a time of a rise of a kind of violent conservative politics, not only in the United States, but in fact worldwide, and also a sense of a shifting world, that a new world was emerging, and yet that world was being kind of suppressed and disabled by an increasingly conservative political view, and one that was increasing. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking too fast. And increasingly military, a military view as well. So the first work I'm going to show you is from a project I did in the late 1980s, part of in New York City where I used to live, and this project was called Messages to the Public. And Messages to the Public was a very large project where artists were invited by the Public Art Fund in New York City to program what was then one of the largest computer-driven light signs in the world, the Spectacolor sign at Times Square. So let me try to get this up for you. Okay. So this is, for those of you who are old enough to remember, this was quite a spectacular presence in Times Square. It looks quite modest now if you've been in Times Square recently, where virtually every surface is covered with large animated signs. But at this time, this was the largest sign in New York City and in the world. The project that I did for the Spectacolor sign was called Evidence. And what I did was each artist had the sign for several weeks. And over the period where I was programming the sign, I would take an image from the front page of the newspaper, that morning's newspaper. And at that time, there were three major dailies in New York City. There was the New York Times, there was the Daily News, and also, I'm forgetting the third. But I would take those images and I would transform them into analyses, and they would go up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it would run throughout the day on 15-minute cycles, where every 15 minutes the sign would appear for 30 seconds. I'm showing this to you today because let me just show you. It was framed by the term evidence. The second frame said, "Picture this." The third frame noted the name of the newspaper. And the fourth frame was a kind of wild description of what the image was. And in this case, the image was of the first test tube quintuplets that were born at that time. I show this to you today because it has been a long preoccupation of mine, the nature of images, and particularly the media images and their capacity to shape not only our understanding of history, but also important, our experience of self and community. So this project was really one of my first attempts to sort of grapple with the stories that we're told and trying to displace those stories and replace them with alternative analyses to engage different forms of experience and understanding. The second series I'm going to show you relates again quite directly to the piece that we planned for here, and it was a series of videotapes that I worked on throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. This series of videotapes was called Counterterror, and it tried to grasp and describe what many of us felt was the changing nature of how we understood politics, not just nationally in the United States, but increasingly globally, particularly with the rise of something we would call now the war on terrorism. To back up a little bit, I was as I said, in art school in the 1980s, but I also worked with a very sprawling collective in New York City called Paper Tiger and Deep Dish Television. And we were a group of activists and filmmakers and artists who wanted to use not only the media as a medium, but also to find ways to propose alternative forms and contexts for media, and importantly to create alternative networks. As part of that project, I was invited to Northern Ireland to help support what was then a media experiment in the UK with the creation of Channel 4. And what that was an attempt to decentralize media production, both in terms of its forms. So there were media workshops set up throughout Britain, Wales, Scotland, and in my case, I worked in Northern Ireland. And the idea was that these were disenfranchised communities that had been excluded from media participation, and that these communities would have their own media production capacity and produce their own programming for broadcast on what was then a new television station or channel in the UK, Channel 4. In the case of Northern Ireland, of course, in the 1980s and well into the 90s, there was a terrible war that had been waging there for, in some estimations or some analyses, for centuries. And it was a quite violent anti-colonial war. One of the things that I worked on, the first tape that I worked on there, was a large project called Mother Ireland, about how women had been represented throughout the history of Irish colonization. And then the second tape, which I'm going to show you images from that, was a tape that I produced and directed, which was about extrajuridical executions in Northern Ireland. That policy was a policy of targeting activists in the North, Republican activists who were in some cases members of the Irish National Liberation Army or the Irish Republican Army, or in some cases not at all members. But the policy was of systematic surveillance and then the killing of these activists outside of all juridical norms in the North. And this policy resulted in the death of literally hundreds of people over a period of about 6 or 7 years in Northern Ireland. So this was the first of a series, what became a series of videotapes, which sought to kind of give that kind of global shape to the new order that was emerging under what we were calling the language of terrorism. What this story was about, even more importantly than Dhoruba's individual story, was the story about the systematic effort of the United States government to criminalize radical political activity in the United States, and the specific policy and strategies they used to criminalize those activists, called the Counterintelligence Program. That program, in its shortened version known as COINTELPRO, targeted activists, particularly black activists in the American Civil Rights Movement, activists in certainly the Black Panther Party, who became major targets of this policy, but also activists in the women's movement, the white student left, importantly in the American Indian movement. Virtually no no left-leaning group in the United States for this period was not under surveillance, infiltrated, and in some cases killed through this policy. The final tape that we did was again a collaboration. This was a collaboration with another filmmaker, Annie Goldson. In the case of Northern Ireland, I worked with the full Channel 4 workshop. And the third tape was done with two Lebanese producers, one named Jay Saloom and the other named Walid Rayad, about the consequences of counterterrorism policy in one sector of Beirut in the mid-1990s. So I show these to you to give you a sense of, I think, what in a way undergirds a lot of the violence and also the displacement that has become so much the kind of texture of our everyday lives, if not directly, indirectly. That this is a long history, I think, of a period which many people have now called a period of permanent war, since World War II, certainly. In the Cold War, which we know was not cold at all, particularly not cold in Latin America, in Asia, and Africa. A war that resulted in the overturning of whole governments, displacement and killing of whole populations, from there to the war on drugs, and finally to the war on terrorism. That the world is in a type of state of permanent warfare that is hardly commented upon, but nevertheless kind of a foundation for the widespread displacement and violence, again, which we all have come to associate this most unfortunate sense of the global. So perhaps I'll stop there. I just got my 5-minute warning.
Oh, you have 5 minutes.
Oh, I have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So the final thing I guess I'd like to say is that there's a kind of spatial challenge that we tried to address in this work. In a way, the media feeds us a version of the world, and certainly in the Counterterror Project and much of the work we also did in Paper Tiger and Deep Dish, we tried to create a sense of alternative networks that we could connect across communities, across geographies and histories to create a vibrant counter-narrative about the present. The final thing I'll do is show you the text that will be installed here in a few weeks, hopefully, with the opening of the show. Original notes, and it grew out of a media accident, I should say. And as you may or may not remember, in the last year, Manuel Noriega died, and he had been, of course, imprisoned in the United States, taken prisoner during the invasion of Panama. And there were various kinds of eulogies in the U.S. media at the time of his death. We heard an interview with a well-known journalist who had known Noriega, had written extensively about him, particularly a long feature piece in the New Yorker magazine. And in the course of that interview, the journalist said something which struck us as powerfully troubling. And he referred to what happened in Panama and indeed what he called the wars in Central and Latin America as footnotes to history. And what he meant by that was that history had been superseded by what has become the war on terror in terms of the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, that what had happened in Latin America would be only remembered as, again, a marginal set of incidents. It's troubling from many, many perspectives, not least of which is the importance of those struggles, the role the United States played and continues to play, and also the continuity between those struggles and where we find ourselves today. Certainly, the testing of new technologies, the testing of new strategies, the amplification of the criminalization of politics, the extensive kind of momentum gained around states of emergency in which to enact policies and strategies of yes, yeah, could you go through those? All of that has its resonance, and in some cases, its history here in Latin America. This project specifically took the instance of the development of GPS technology and smart bomb technology in terms of the U.S. involvement in the defeat of FARC and other smaller leftist rebel groups here in Colombia. When this is installed, there are 10 small light boxes in the gallery, which are about this big and are mounted low on the wall and contain these texts. For us, I'm sorry? Yeah. So the final thing is this is an attempt to sort of re-narrate this history, to also demonstrate its centrality to a kind of global history and kind of point to an alternative form of understanding as we rethink our kind of world relations. Yes. This is a mix of text taken from the media, from the Washington Post, for example, from some broadcast media outlets, Democracy Now! And this final piece, some of you may recognize, is by the great Salvadoran Nicaraguan poet, Claribel Alegría. So thank you.
First, I want to contextualize myself, give you a sense of where I'm coming from, and how that experience has influenced my practice as a visual artist. As Dalida mentioned in her brief introduction of me, I was born and raised in the United States. My parents come from the Philippines. So I'm a second-generation Filipino-American. To give you a sense of what that means, in the home, I experienced a Filipino life, Filipino language, Filipino food. As I started entering the school system, I certainly was subjected, I would say, to the kinds of ideologies that are part and parcel of what it means to become a proper U.S. subject. And I would say that part of that indoctrination has a lot to do with forgetting. There was a silent logic of assimilation where the shared history, for example, of the United States and the Philippines was completely erased from any history books that I was exposed to. And so as I moved through my education, and when I was a student like you in college, it became very urgent for me to delve into history and to begin to understand what that amnesia and forgetting, that imposed amnesia and forgetting was about, and to begin to learn about where it is that I come from in a deep historical way. So just to give you a sense of how I want to contextualize this history, this is a map of the quote-unquote territorial growth of the United States. I would also say that it's a map of genocide, the genocide of Native Americans and slavery. And that movement westward didn't just stop at the western edge of the United States, but actually continued across the Pacific Ocean. And so in this map, you see Hawaii, the Midway Islands, Guam, and the Philippines as a part of that westward expansion of the United States. And so when I started delving into the colonial archive, I found a book when I was about, maybe some of your age is here, called Our New Possessions in the Philippine Islands. It was a colonial book meant for popular circulation to expose the people of the United States to their new colony. And I just want to show you a few images from that text that have really influenced my practice since that time. It's been 20 years since I saw these images. And one of them is this. It's a picture of a U.S. soldier and a Filipina. And I would say that this kind of visualization of Filipina as a site of sexual availability is coupled with the way that the Filipino man was represented in the same volume, which is as someone to be killed. And this was also simultaneous with a moment when any Filipino boy over 10 was supposed to be killed by the U.S. military because they had a memory of a time before U.S. occupation. This is another image. It's a stereoscope. You're supposed to look at this image through an apparatus that makes it look three-dimensional. But I'm interested in the way that the Filipinas are represented here, which is trapped. They're trapped between the U.S. soldiers in the background and the camera in the foreground. So for me, this question about the colonial visuality of the Philippines has also is something I've thought about into the present in terms of, really what is possible at a global level in terms of representation? How is it possible to see or to image aspects or conditions of the world that are normally erased from developed world consciousness? And so the piece that I want to play a brief clip for you of is a piece that's entitled Basing Landscapes. I completed it in 2013. And maybe just to begin, I want to share this quote, which is from a landscape architect whose name is escaping me right now. I'll come back to it later. But this landscape architect says, "I suspect no landscape, vernacular or otherwise, can be comprehended unless we perceive it as an organization of space, unless we ask ourselves who owns or uses the spaces, how they were created, and how they change." And this is a way of introducing that the way I'm dealing with the question of landscape is much more than just a picture to be imaged, but actually asking these questions about use, economy, and the who is involved. And Basing Landscapes is a work that that activates and engages the voices of women who lived and who are living around the former U.S. military bases in the Philippines. There are women who worked as prostitutes around the former U.S. military bases. And the second section is a woman who is an active environmental activist who has been trying to bring attention to the kind of toxicity left by the bases after their departure in 1992. So just to give you a little bit of background, in 1991, the Philippine Senate rejected the extension of U.S. bases on Philippine soil. There were two prominent bases in the northern island of Luzon, Clark Air Force Base and Subic Air Force Base. And during that time, about 16,000 women were working as prostitutes around the bases, many of them coming from other provinces to work in those areas. And in addition, the U.S. left a tremendous amount of toxicity around the base. The kinds of things that they left were asbestos, heavy metals, fuels. They poured chemicals from firefighting exercises directly into the water table and underground storage tanks. They pumped 3.75 million gallons of untreated sewage into local fishing and swimming waters around the Subic area. And all of this toxicity has created problems for all of the generations to come, not only the people who were present during the time of the bases, but the generations after. So people are living with conditions like skin disease, women experience high rate of miscarriages, stillbirths, birth defects, cancer, heart ailments, leukemia. So there's a way in which, this work is thinking about the afterlife of these bases. And the structure of the work moves between the voices of these women, and it begins with the ruins of the former U.S. military base, but extends outwards to an adjacent volcano. So although the Philippine Senate rejected the extension of U.S. bases on Philippine soil in 1991, it wasn't until 1992 that the U.S. was actually forced to leave by a volcano, the eruption of a volcano, Mount Pinatubo, which had been dormant for 600 years, and which was adjacent to Clark Air Force Base. So it was this eruption of the volcano that actually